In my recent programs, I've discussed panic, how panic ebbs and flows, how it is interrupted sometimes by brief periods of irrational euphoria. And I said that over the last couple of weeks, it's become clear as the effect, the psychological boost caused by the House of Representatives appropriation has faded away. It's become clear that panic is now gradually starting to return, as it's also become clear that the latest arms packages that have been agreed, the Western powers have agreed with respect to Ukraine, as those arms packages are failing to deliver the outcome that Western governments hoped they would. And over the last couple of hours, those symptoms of panic have become more visible, and actions that Western governments are starting to take are becoming more reckless and more dangerous. Now, there have been two exceptionally concerning articles by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times. Now, Stephen Bryan is an authoritative figure. He is somebody who has served within the United States government, who has who has worked in the what one might call the sprawling national security bureaucracy of the United States, who in the past, I understand, has taken fairly hardline positions on various conflicts, but who clearly is in strong disagreement with current US policy with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. Now, the two articles that I'm going to discuss today are one which has already received a huge amount of attention, in which he says that the troops of the French Foreign Legion have already been deployed in Ukraine. But the other article, which I think in some respects is even more concerning, has attracted far less attention. And it is an article which touches on the possibility of US troops being deployed to Ukraine also, and which in effect speaks of an imminent World War III as the panic and alarm grows across the United States and Europe that Ukraine is going to lose the war. And this article that Stephen Bryan wrote. It was published on the 26th of April. It appears not to have been widely noticed, but this is what it says. NATO starts deploying troops as Russia races to win. The plan to try and ward off disaster seems to be to fill in gaps in Ukraine's forces by importing advisors. And the word advisors is in quotation marks. And this is what the article then goes on to say. NATO is starting to deploy combat troops to Ukraine. Soldiers from Poland, France, the UK, Finland, and other NATO members are arriving in larger numbers. Although Russia says there are over 3,100 mercenaries in Ukraine, these newly arriving troops are not mercenaries. They are in uniform, home country proclaimed via insignia. They mostly are concentrated in the western part of the country, although in some cases they are close to the actual fighting in the east. And we will come to that shortly. And then Stephen Bryan goes on to say NATO is putting out the word these are not combat soldiers, but are in Ukraine to operate sophisticated Western hardware. But if they're firing at the Russians, the only proper way to interpret their presence is that they're playing an active part in the shooting war. More or less, this is the same pattern that the US used when it sent advisors to Vietnam In fact, they were US Special Forces who engaged in combat. The Biden administration, at least for public consumption, says it opposes sending NATO soldiers to Ukraine, but Biden, in truth, may be waiting for his re-election before he gives the order for US soldiers to fight in Ukraine. After Biden is re-elected, he will have a free hand. The recent package of the $60 billion aid bill for Ukraine signals that Congress will go along with whatever the Biden administration wants to do, fighting the Russians. The national security establishment fears a Russian victory in Ukraine. It would constitute a major setback in America's security strategy and would be a blow, even a fatal one, to NATO. Reportedly, the Russian army is now 15% bigger than it was before the Ukraine war. It is also far more experienced, and the Russians have found ways to deal with US high-tech systems such as jamming and spoofing. Meanwhile, NATO is far behind Russia in weapons, manpower, and industrial might. Further, stockpiles of weapons are very low, and equipment supposedly for national defense has been sent to Ukraine, leaving defenses wanting. The consensus opinion in the US national security establishment is that Ukraine is losing its war with Russia and could potentially face the collapse of its army. There already are reports that some brigades in the Ukrainian armed forces are refusing orders from their commanders. These include the 25th Airborne Assault Brigade, the 115th Brigade, the 67th Mechanized Brigade, which abandoned positions in Chasiv Yar, and the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which demanded rotation after more than a year on the front line. These are top army brigades and not territorial defense units. And the article then goes on to say that there are lots of problems. Ukraine is having lots of problems finding replacements. Stephen Bryan adds that a report on training of Ukrainian F-16 pilots is revealing, according to some Western officers working with the Ukrainians, progress even after a year teaching pilots to operate F-16s has been less than a success. Language barriers and unfamiliarity with Western systems and combat tactics has proven to slow the learning process. Rumours have it that when the F-16s finally begin arriving in Ukraine this summer, the planes are likely to be handled by retired pilots. The word retired is in quotation marks, from European air forces. NATO's plan to try to ward off disaster seems to be to fill in gaps in Ukraine's forces by importing advisors, waiting for the United States to commit its army to the battle after the election in November. And he then says the Russians know this and are in a race to try and collapse Ukraine's army before Biden returns to office, if in fact he does. If the Russians are successful, a bigger war in Europe will be avoided. If not, with the introduction of US forces, Europe will be plunged into World War III. This is already terrifying information. But then directly after that article appeared, shortly after that article appeared, Stephen Bryan provides us with more information about those so-called NATO advisors who are entering Ukraine. Some of them, mostly they're in Western Ukraine, as he says, but some of them are close to the front lines. And this is the article which has attracted attention. He says that France sends combat troops to Ukraine battlefront. Will the deployment of a foreign legion unit commanded by French officers trigger a wider European war? France has sent its first troops officially to Ukraine. They have been deployed in support of the Ukrainian 54th Independent Mechanized Brigade in Slavyansk. The French soldiers are drawn from France's 3rd Infantry Regiment, which is one of the main elements of the French Foreign Legion. And we are given an explanation that this is a different setup from the one before, where France encouraged Russian and Ukrainian soldiers within the French Foreign Legion to go to fight in Ukraine as contractors. Now it looks like this is going to be an actual deployment by the Legion itself, And he says that the initial group of French soldiers numbers around 100. This is just the first tranche of around 1,500 French soldiers scheduled to arrive in France. These troops are being posted directly in a hot combat area and are intended to help the Ukrainians, resist Russian advances in Donbass. The first 100 are artillery and surveillance specialists. And we're told that for months, French President Macron has been threatening to send French troops to Ukraine. He has found little or no support from NATO countries outside of support from Poland and the Baltic states. Allegedly, the US opposes sending NATO soldiers to Ukraine other than as advisors. And then Stephen Bryan asks whether this will be perceived by the Russians as crossing of a red line. And Stephen Bryan also says France itself does not have many troops to put on Ukraine's battle lines, should the French government want to do so. According to reports today, France cannot support an overseas deployment of a full division and won't have this capability until 2027 at the earliest. And the decision to send foreign legionnaires is itself a peculiar French compromise. France is not deploying its home army, and besides the small number of officers, the men sent are not French citizens. France's decision has two meanings, beyond the obvious one of potentially triggering a pan-European war. First of all, it allows Macron to send troops to Ukraine and act like a tough guy without encountering much home opposition. That's because no French army soldiers are being sent, and there is no consequent conscription or other measures in the offing. This clearly reduces the potential fury of Macron's political opponents. The second is Macron's anger at seeing French troops getting kicked out of Sahelian Africa. Well, I'm not going to discuss all of that. I've already said that I find that wholly irrational, but it does look as if President Macron has taken the collapse of France's position in Africa very much to heart. And then Stephen Bryan goes on to say it isn't clear how the Legion can help the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians know how to operate artillery, and they have sophisticated intelligence support, some of it generated by their own FPV drones and spies, and some of it thanks to US and other NATO intelligence and surveillance assets supporting Ukraine. Anyway, the Ukrainian issue is not about how to use artillery, but where the ammunition is supposed to come from. And Ukraine continues to complain it lacks adequate supplies for its howitzers. The decision to put Legion soldiers in Slavyansk is extremely provocative and goes against statements from the French side, including Macron, to the effect that if France sent troops, they would replace Ukrainian units in western Ukraine, who could therefore be moved eastwards to fight the Russians. As Slavyansk is on the front line, this French image of a soft deployment is turning into a war with Russia directly. A key question is how NATO will react to the French decision to deploy, as France is acting on its own without NATO's backing. The French cannot claim support from NATO under its famous Article 5, the collective security component of the NATO treaty. Should the Russians attack French troops outside of Ukraine, it would be justified because NATO has decided to be a combatant, and forcing an Article 5 vote would seem to be difficult, if not impossible. Now, note here Stephen Bryan talking about the Russians attacking France outside Ukraine. We'll come to that in a moment. Of course, NATO members individually could support the French either by sending their own forces or backstopping the French logistically and in communications. Right now, no one can answer how any of these questions would resolve themselves with any degree of certainty. It is unlikely the Russians will long tolerate a build-up of French army troops, even if they are French Legion soldiers. What Russia will do in response is not certain. So these are two very disturbing articles. One, drawing the parallel with Vietnam, which is one that I made all the way back. I think it, for the first time, I think it was in the summer of 2022. Over the course of the conflict in Vietnam, starting basically from the early 1960s, the United States said that it would provide military and technical support to the government of South Vietnam. Then it said that it would send advisors to South Vietnam, who exactly as Stephen Bryan points out, were in reality special forces troops who actually carried out actual combat in Vietnam. The president, Lyndon Johnson, however, continued to insist that he would not send US ground forces and military forces to fight in Vietnam. He went on saying that right up to the 1964 presidential election, which he won by a landslide, and then shortly after, he deployed US troops to Vietnam with catastrophic consequences for the United States, which we all know. And way back, as I said, I think it was in the summer of 2022, I discussed the parallels, how the conflict in Ukraine in many ways resembles the conflict in Vietnam, how Russia fills the role that North Vietnam had in that conflict, and South Vietnam and Ukraine, with its well-known problems of corruption, its army, which is starting to break down, and which is showing signs of demoralization, also fills quite well the role of South Vietnam, and how the United States became ever more deeply involved in the conflict in Vietnam, whilst constantly giving the American people assurances that that would never happen. And, well, according to Stephen Bryan, we are in the same process. And it's not widely known, but the United States was not the only Western power to send troops to Vietnam. Australia, for example, did also. And we see how a coalition of the willing is being cobbled together, at least according to Stephen Bryan, to do the same thing. He says that there are already French troops in Vietnam, in Ukraine. These are drawn from the French Foreign Legion. They have arrived in Slavyansk, but they are directly participating in combat roles, and again, the Russians are likely to respond to this. And of course, Stephen Bryan says that all of this runs a massive potential risk of triggering World War III. Well, we now have statements from the Russians, from very senior Russians, in fact, giving us a strong clue as to what they think about all of this, and how the Russians will respond. Firstly, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has discussed Stephen Bryan's article about the deployment of the French Foreign Legion. And Peskov, speaking today, said we need to understand here whether this information is correct. Our military is looking into this information. So it looks as if the Russians have not heard of this information. Their first indication about this deployment is that article by Stephen Bryan. But the Russians are already responding, and they're responding in very menacing ways. So we've had a statement now from Dmitry Medvedev, who is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, and I think is in effect Putin's number two. Anyway, he's written on his Telegram channel some very strong words. He says this: sending their troops to the territory of former Ukraine will mean NATO's direct involvement in the war. We, which is to say Russia, will have to respond to this, and alas, not on the territory of former Ukraine. Now, bear in mind what Stephen Bryan said in his article about the deployment of the French Foreign Legion. The Russians would be entitled to see the French deployment to Ukraine and French participation in the fighting in Ukraine as an act of war, and might legitimately take military steps against the French outside Ukraine. And here we have Medvedev telling us essentially the same thing. And then Medvedev goes on to say, Western leaders won't be able to hide on Capitol Hill or in the Elysee Palace or in 10 Downing Street. A global catastrophe will ensue. He then goes on to say some kind of total degradation of the ruling class in the West is underway. US President Kennedy and Russian leader Khrushchev could grasp the dangers 60 years ago. He's referring now obviously to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet current immature imbeciles who have got to power in the West keep failing to recognize this. So this is a very threatening message from Medvedev, and well, it's now being backed by further strong action by the Russians, because beyond Peskov's statement that the Russians are seeking to check whether the reports of the French deployments are true, and Medvedev's warnings that participation of NATO troops in the fighting in Ukraine could lead to a wider war, we've now have the announcement from Russia that on Putin's direct orders, Russia is now conducting exercises in the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And this is the statement about this, which has now been provided by the Russian Defense Ministry. On behalf of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, in order to increase the readiness of non-strategic nuclear forces to carry out combat tasks, the General Staff began preparations for an exercise with the Southern Military District's missile formations, including aviation as well as the Navy. During the exercises, a set of measures will be taken to practice the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. The purpose of the exercise is to maintain the readiness of combat units, personnel, and equipment of non-strategic nuclear weapons to react, and in order to ensure definitively Russia's territorial integrity and sovereignty in response to provocative statements and threats made by certain Western officials against the Russian Federation. and it's not difficult to work out that the officials, amongst the officials they have in mind, is President Macron of France. Now, whilst I am on the topic of Western officials making provocative statements, I should say that there's also been some pretty reckless comments made by the United States, by in the United States, by Hakeem Jeffries, who is the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. He is quoted as saying in an interview with CBS television the following: "We can't let Ukraine fall because if it does, then there is a significant likelihood that America will have to get into the conflict, not simply with our money, but with our servicemen and with our servicewomen and our servicemen." And then Jeffries complains about a pro-Russian faction in the Republican Party, which is gaining momentum, and which he accused of delaying the approval of additional funding for Ukraine's military needs. This faction does not want to support Ukraine and does not believe that Russia is an enemy of the United States and is led by Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, a lot of people have rushed to make all kinds of conclusions based on what Hakeem Jeffries has said. My own view is that these comments from Jeffries, coming at this particularly fraught time with the possible deployment of French troops to Ukraine, the incredibly provocative statements from Emmanuel Macron, the comments from Stephen Bryan about advisors being sent to Ukraine to perform combat missions. I think this is extremely ill-advised statements from Jeffries, but for the record, I don't think he's actually talking about the US sending combat troops to fight in Ukraine. It's the usual narrative that we've been hearing for months, that the US needs to support Ukraine because if Ukraine falls, then the Russians are going to advance on the rest of Europe, and therefore the West needs to go on supporting Ukraine, because if the Russians advance into the rest of Europe, then at that point the United States will be forced to fight the Russians. So I think that Jeffries is basically repeating a story that we have already heard before, repeating the same comments that he has made before. The real purpose of his words are clearly to attack what he calls the pro-Russian faction in the Republican Party, and Marjorie Taylor Greene in particular, and to imply that the Republican Party, and by extension President Trump, are somehow disloyal to the United States in advance of the election. But nonetheless, it's a deeply provocative, ill-judged statement at this specific time. The Russians will have heeded it. They will certainly have heeded Macron's words. And as we now see, they are starting exercises with tactical nuclear weapons. And we've had the Russian Defense Ministry saying that this has been done in direct response to these provocative statements and threats made by certain Western officials, which of course includes Macron. And we also read that Peskov has gone on to confirm the same thing. He's talked about how the Russians are working to find out whether there really are French troops deployed in Ukraine. But he then goes on to say, and I'm taking now this from Redovka, that the Peskov emphasized that in this case we're talking about statements. This is about the military exercises, the exercises with tactical nuclear weapons. We're talking about statements by French President Macron as well as British representatives, and that of course includes Foreign Secretary David Cameron, who previously spoke of their intention to send armed troops to Ukraine. That is, and this is a direct quote now, to actually line up NATO soldiers in front of the Russian military. This is a new round of escalation. It is unprecedented and requires special measures. So we see that the Russians are responding. They're engaging in exercises with tactical nuclear weapons. They're preparing for the possibility of Western troop deployments to Ukraine, and they're making it very clear that if that happens, that will result in armed conflict between the Russians and NATO, or NATO troops in Ukraine. Medvedev follows up with the threat, previously discussed as a possibility by Stephen Bryan, that the Russians could start taking action against France in particular, but other NATO countries as well, outside the geographical area of the Ukraine conflict. And anyway, we see a massive heightening of tension in almost every conceivable respect. So what exactly is going on? Are we really in the situation that we appear to be in, where NATO and the US are deploying or thinking of deploying troops to Ukraine, and the Russians are giving serious thought to fighting those troops, to launching attacks against NATO countries outside Ukraine, and are now actively considering use of nuclear weapons? Are we really in that position? Well, the answer is we might be, but I have to add some caveats. Now, Stephen Bryan is an extremely well-informed person. I am sure that he's not writing these articles out of nothing. He's obviously getting information, but so far, he is the only source I know who speaks about the French Foreign Legion having been actually deployed to the battlefields of Ukraine. Up to this point, there is no independent corroboration of this or confirmation of this. And as Peskov has indicated, the Russians, up to this point, have no information about this either. And they are taking steps to see whether or not Stephen Bryan's claims about the deployment of the French Foreign Legion to Ukraine are actually true. I wonder whether this information has been passed on to Stephen Bryan by some people in the West floating test balloons. In other words, that the French deployment to Slavyansk has not yet actually happened. I can't help but think that if it had happened, the Russians would know about it. That the deployment of advisors in a combat role has not yet happened either. And that we are, again, still very much in the early stages of the decision-making connected to this process. And that some people in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere are spreading these stories to see how the Russians would react. And we've seen that the Russians are reacting very strongly. They're talking about nuclear weapons. They're talking about conducting strikes against NATO troops outside Ukraine, and they're sending the strongest possible signal to NATO that if this happens, then the escalation and the confrontation will be of a sort that would be everyone's worst nightmare. That, at least, is what I hope this all means. And I say this because, again, I wonder whether the Russians really would be caught by surprise by a French deployment to Slavyansk, and would generally only find out about it from reading a piece by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times. Just saying. But all of this is extremely disturbing and alarming, and perhaps it explains something else which happened about a week ago, which is that a prominent Russian journalist, he looked to me like Dmitry Kiselyov, who I believe it was Dmitry Kiselyov, and he is a very, very prominent Russian journalist indeed. Anyway, he did an absolutely terrifying program in which he spoke about how if there was a conflict between the Russian military and NATO forces in Ukraine, the situation would quickly reach the stage of World War III, and he was talking about strategic weapons, the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, the Avant-Garde hypersonic glide vehicle. All these are strategic weapons being deployed in action. In other words, we would be heading towards not just World War III, but a World War III with an overwhelming nuclear exchange, the kind of conflict that was threatened at various times during the Cold War, but was only just avoided. Now, again, that might have been the Russians sending a signal to the West, but I think it would be absolutely reckless. It would be disastrous to simply think that the Russians are bluffing. And it would be also, I think, a huge mistake to think that these ideas about Western deployments to Ukraine are simply a bluff in themselves. Now, I want to make a number of further observations. In subsequent statements, Macron, in order to again explain why it is essential that Ukraine be preserved, he spoke about the fact that if Ukraine falls, Russian military equipment, including Russian missiles, ballistic missiles, could be deployed further to the west, closer to the European heartlands, and this would be an unacceptable threat for Europe, which is an astonishing statement because, of course, as several people have now pointed out, what Macron is doing here is engaging in mirror imaging. He says that deployments of Russian missiles in Ukraine would compromise European security and is something that must be prevented at all costs, even as he must know, in fact he does know because it's been pointed out to him by multitudes of Russian spokesmen who made the point many times, that for the Russians, the deployment of Western missiles, nuclear weapons in Ukraine is also perceived as an existential threat and is the reason why we have had the special military operation take place. So what is unacceptable when it is done to the Europeans is apparently fine when it is done to the Russians. Again, the arrogance and the inability to think clearly or to accept that the other side has any legitimate security concerns or rights to security at all is at the heart of this whole crisis. But Macron has been making these comments and taking these extreme, maybe if he's really engaging in these deployments, making these dangerous decisions. But it's clear that there is still resistance within NATO to them. Now, the Italian defense minister has come out and made some very strong comments about Macron. He's said that he doesn't want to make criticisms of the leader of a friendly country, but he is extremely upset and worried about the fact that the way that Macron has been speaking, that there is no consensus or agreement within Europe to deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine, and that Italy resolutely opposes any such idea. So that was the Italian defense minister. And I'm sure other European governments think the same way. And I can say with confidence that the European population also feels the same way also. And in the United States, I believe that this is equally true. So there would be massive political resistance across the West to doing anything like this. But even as the Italian defense minister was speaking out against this idea, an Italian newspaper, La Repubblica, talks about NATO's red lines in Ukraine. One, which is a very, very garbled red line, which makes very little sense, involving Belarus and Russian troop movements from Belarus. Very difficult to understand exactly what it means. But it appears to mean that NATO will not accept the fall of Kiev. That if the Russian army were to capture Kiev, that would cross for NATO a red line. And the other is that if there is a collapse in Ukraine, that the Russians then advance beyond Ukraine. Obviously, if they attack Poland, the Baltic states, or Finland, they would be attacking NATO countries. But Moldova has been thrown in as well into this group, that an Russian invasion of Moldova would also be a red line, despite the fact, of course, that Moldova, which is going through a deep political crisis, is not, in fact, a NATO country. So we could see, and one could sense is that all kinds of arguments, quarrels, discussions are taking place. There's no certainty about what the Europeans or the Americans are actually planning to do. The Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski, again spoke about the need to keep the Russians guessing, to maintain some kind of strategic ambiguity towards the Russians. Macron, by the way, said something similar in his interview with The Economist. And it could be, as I said before, that all of these claims about French deployments to Ukraine, the latest claims about advisors, all of that are further attempts to keep the Russians guessing. Well, if so, let me say that the Russian responses, particularly the drills on tactical nuclear weapons, are a sign of how reckless and irresponsible all that is. Because these moves by the Western powers, whatever uncertainties they might be creating in Moscow are not leading to any softening of the Russian position with respect to Ukraine. They're simply leading to the Russians preparing for the ultimate escalation. Is that really what Western governments ought to be doing at this particular juncture, at this particular time? I don't know. Now, going back to what I said at the very start of this program, all of these maneuvers, these statements, discussions about French troops in Ukraine, the talk about the advisors in Ukraine, the talk about President Biden authorizing the use of US forces in Ukraine in the event that he's elected. All of this, as I said, it may be a game that's being played with the Russians, or it might be a plan. We don't fully know. But it's a sign, again, of panic, of an understanding in the West that the situation in Ukraine is getting out of control. And again, the concept of peace is not one that Western leaders can entertain, at least not a peace which requires concessions to the Russians, even on Russia's legitimate core security interests. What they have to do instead, because they're in panic, is they have to spin or perhaps plan these incredibly dangerous actions without perhaps thinking through the consequences. Because if these things really are being planned, or if they're not being planned, but we're getting all these signs in order to unsettle the Russians, well, we can see the effect that they're actually having. They're causing the Russians to start to do things which no Western government should want them to do, to engage in tactical nuclear weapons drills, or to talk about launching attacks on NATO positions outside Ukraine. It's an invariable symptom of panic that people who are trapped in it start making decisions without thinking them through. And I'm afraid the events of the last couple of hours conclusively show us that that is what we're seeing happen now. The West is panicking. It's either thinking about joining the war itself, or it's trying to throw dust into the Russians' eyes by pretending that it will. But instead of deterring the Russians, all it is doing is provoking them and provoking the Russians into taking steps which could lead not just the West, but perhaps the whole of humanity towards the ultimate disaster. Medvedev talked about Western leaders as imbeciles, and frankly, in light of what we see today, one can hardly disagree. Anyway, let's move on and first of all look to perhaps something that might be a little bit more hopeful, which is that the one adult in the room who might be able to knock some sense into the Europeans is now in Europe, and that is, of course, Xi Jinping of China, President Xi Jinping of China. He has written a powerful co-ed in which he has spoken about the need for Europe and China to work together on all kinds of issues, including a resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. I have no doubt that Xi Jinping will be trying to impress on Macron the recklessness of what France, or at least Macron himself, is doing. But all the indications are that Macron, for his part, is going to take a very hard line with Xi Jinping over Ukraine, something which will be deeply unwelcome to the Chinese and to the Chinese president, and which he is certain to push back against. But anyway, at least there is someone able to speak to the Europeans, and to tell them, and to the Western powers in general, that it's time that they came to their senses. We'll see what comes of that. And the other thing that we now need to take into account is the events that are actually driving the entire situation, that are setting us up for this huge crisis, which is, of course, the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine itself, and it is to this that I'm now going to come. Now, over the last couple of hours, over the course of Easter, in fact, the Russian Defense Ministry finally confirmed that which was obvious for a long time, which is that the Russians are in control of Ocheretino. So the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed this. They also published significant information about the general state of the war. They mentioned that more S-300 missile systems have been destroyed by the Russians. And interestingly enough, they said that over the course of the last week, no fewer than 15 ATACMS missiles had been shot down by Russia's air defense. And that would mean that since the delivery of ATACMS missiles took place in March, the Russians, at least, are saying that no fewer than 25 of these have been shot down. 10 over the course of 1 week, 15 over the course of the next week. And it's very unclear at this moment in time what, if anything, the ATACMS are actually achieving. In fact, there is an article today in the Russian newspaper Izvestia, in which the various Russian officials are starting to express skepticism that the ATACMS is actually able to achieve very much. And we have a quote from a Russian military official in Izvestia. This is a man called Dmitry Kornev. He says that now new missiles provided to the Ukrainian army will definitely not change the outcome of the military confrontation, because wonder weapons don't exist, and this is certainly not what ATACMS missiles are. Russia's S-300, S-400 and Buk systems are capable of downing such missiles. The most advanced S-500 systems, whose deliveries to the air defense forces have already begun, will also be able to cope with targets like these. So we're starting to get the sense that the Russians are starting to think that the ATACMS missiles are not quite the danger that they've been led to think that they were. At least that's, as I said, what the Russians appear to be thinking now. So anyway, that's one part of the military situation. Ocheretino captured, ATACMS missiles unsuccessful. But in fact, over the course of the Easter holiday, at least the Orthodox Easter holiday, lots of news of further Russian advances. Now, there's been confirmation that the Russians not only control the industrial zone in Krasnogorovka, but that they control all the high-rise buildings in Krasnogorovka, something which makes Ukrainian defense in Krasnogorovka, the remaining part of Krasnogorovka all but impossible. There are reports that the Russians, having captured Ocheretino, are now enlarging the territory that they control around Ocheretino, with further advances towards the town of Novo Alexandrovna to the west, and indeed towards the village of Sokol, which also lies to the west of Ocheretino. There's also reports that the Russians are now very close and have captured, in fact, most of Netailovo, and that the battle for that place is also gradually coming to an end. And there's also there were reports over the weekend of further Russian advances in the Chasov Yar area, with the Russians now fighting both within the micro-district and in some other places on the northeastern part of Chasov Yar, even as they are able to send more troops towards the canal area to the south of Chasov Yar as well. So lots of fighting going on, with the Russians continuing to make their advances. The confirmation of the fall of Ocheretino, by the way, vindicates the point I've said many times, which is that the reports we're getting from sources, Ukrainian and Russian, corroborate each other, and that those who've been worried about the fact that there are no geolocations of film of actual fighting or control of particular positions in this part of the front line, that those concerns were misplaced. We've also heard further news, by the way, of significant Russian advances in the Kupiansk area. Both Kislovka, the village that the Russians entered a couple of days ago, and apparently Kotlerovka, a neighboring village, also appear to have been captured by the Russians, who seem to be positioning themselves for a possible flanking move leading to an advance on Kupiansk from the south as well as from the east, where the Russians are still encamped, occupying part of the village of Sinkovka. So anyway, further Russian advances. I don't agree, by the way, with what Stephen Bryan is saying, that the Russians are engaging the West with some sort of race. My own sense of Russian military operations on the battlefronts is that the Russians, though they have been advancing relatively fast, are continuing to operate in the way that they always have done ever since the war started in earnest in around April, May 2022, which is that they are maintaining an even, steady tempo of military operations. What the Russian Defense Ministry spoke about some weeks ago, when it said that Russian military operations are rhythmical in nature. That the Russians, in other words, advance, but at their own pace. They're not going to let calendrical dates like the Victory Day holiday on the 9th of May or the Easter holiday influence their moves on the battlefronts. And they're not going to be panicked into taking reckless and unwise steps on the battlefronts because of whatever it is that the Western powers may be doing or planning to do with respect to sending troops to Ukraine. I think that in terms of conventional force, the Russians are confident anyway that whatever conventional forces the Western powers do send to Ukraine, they could deal with. But of course, it's not the capability of those forces which worries them. It's whether those Western forces, if they were to be deployed in Ukraine, might come with nuclear weapons, for example, creating a further escalation, which is why the Russians are prepared, are making all of these strong signals about the strength of their resolve and their ability to respond. So we see continued Russian advances. We see continued Russian drone and missile strikes. We see how the Russians seem to be continuing with their plan to enlarge the breach they've created in the Ukrainian front lines in the Ocheretino area. Simplikius, the thinker, had a really interesting piece up yesterday in which he discussed the various comments that Ukrainian military officials are making about Russian plans, that the Ukrainians seem to think that if there is a Russian offensive in Kharkiv, it's probably intended as a diversion in order to pin the Ukrainian armed soldiers to try to defend positions in Kharkiv. The main Russian blow will take place precisely where the Russians have achieved their great breakthrough, which is in central Donbass, where the Russians have broken through in Avdiivka and Ocheretino, and are going to break through very soon in Krasnogorovka and in Chasiv Yar. So that is the center of gravity of the war, as it has been ever since April 2022, after the Istanbul negotiations were broken off. So, a very fraught, very dangerous situation altogether. Growing signs, as I said, of panic in the West, signals that perhaps have not been fully coordinated between all of the NATO powers. Italy, for example, seems to have been completely kept out of the loop if there's been a decision to send troops to Ukraine, and has spoken up strongly against this idea. I think perhaps Germany, equally reluctant. Macron, straining at the leash to try to project himself as the strong figure, perhaps having dispatched the Foreign Legion to Slavyansk, where it's going to be smashed, by the way, if it really is there, and huge uncertainty as to what the Biden administration plans, with advisors being sent, who are probably being sent there, in order to conduct operations. But let's take a step back. Remember that Western forces are very depleted. Western arsenals, rather, are very depleted. The Russian military is growing in strength and power and experience. I wonder whether, in the end, Western leaders will be prepared to take the plunge and deploy their weakened forces against a Russian military now firmly in the ascendant, and whether, in the end, they really are prepared to risk World War III and their own destruction, even if they can avoid the massive popular and political opposition they would encounter by following through on all of these reckless things that are now being talked about. Well, we must never misjudge the capacity, underestimate the capacity for doing crazy and reckless things that that we've seen from Western leaders. But I wonder whether in the end, given that we are talking about Russia, a nuclear superpower, whether they really will be prepared to go to all of these lengths, or whether rather, as events start to take their own course on the battle lines, amidst huge anger and recrimination, they will come to understand that there is nothing realistically which can be done. We'll see. Anyway, let's move on, because of course it's not just Russia that the West is now in conflict with. The West is now also in conflict with China. And by the way, it is becoming increasingly, getting increasingly into conflict with India as well. The last is incredible, but there have been a number of incredibly harsh statements made, including by the President Biden himself, about India, which have provoked inevitably a strong reaction. Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar is now responding to criticisms from the United States and from the West. It's astonishing that, having got themselves into a losing conflict with one nuclear superpower, which is Russia, they are now squaring up to a conflict with another, even more powerful nuclear superpower, which is China, and they are threatening to get themselves drawn into a conflict with the third nuclear superpower, a rising nuclear superpower, which is in India as well. It all seems incredibly reckless, but we've had a very strong article, or editorial rather, from Global Times newspaper, published ultimately by the Chinese Communist Party, about the state of relations between the United States and China in the aftermath of Secretary of State Blinken's visit to China. And the article is entitled "US Actions, the Primary Drivers of Potential Instability in China Ties." And it goes on to say, US Secretary of State Blinken left Beijing 10 days ago. What has Washington said and done about China since then? After concluding his visit to China, Blinken once again stated, "We're looking at the actions that we're fully prepared to take if we don't see a change. We've already imposed sanctions on more than 100 Chinese entities, export controls, and we're fully prepared to take additional measures." On Wednesday, the US announced sanctions against almost 300 targets that allegedly assist Russia in evading sanctions, including 20 companies from the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong. On Thursday, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin hosted Japanese Defense Minister Minoru Kihara, Australian Defense Chief Richard Marles, and Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro in Honolulu to build up what they call collective capacity to push back against Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. On Friday, Secretary Blinken said that the United States, boosted by allies and the private sector, is delivering for Pacific Islands, even if Washington alone cannot match China's growing footprint. This is seen as the preferred strategy of the United States to outcompete China in this region. The actions and statements made by the United States, particularly its systematic implementation of a competitive strategy towards China, are the primary drivers of potential instability in China-US relations. In discussions with US officials, including Blinken, Chinese officials, who of course include Wang Yi and Xi Jinping in this case, have repeatedly emphasized that China and the US should be partners, not adversaries, a matter of broad strategic direction. China-US relations have reached a critical juncture. The path chosen will directly determine whether the direction evolves towards mutual loss or mutual gain with no middle ground. Washington is attempting to compete vigorously with China while seeking cooperation in certain areas, which is somewhat contradictory given its policy trends towards unilateral victory. President Biden has repeatedly expressed his intention to compete against China and win. We are in competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century, President Biden said in his first address to Congress in April 2021. This is precisely why China-US relations are complex to stabilize, as they are seen by the United States essentially as a zero-sum game. Long-term hegemony has cultivated an arrogant and self-important attitude in Washington. The politicians and strategists currently guiding US policy have grown up during the peak of US domination, often viewing global relations through a hegemonic lens. They lack a proper and realistic understanding of the geopolitical shifts and changes in national power triggered by globalization and China's development. They continue using Cold War era basic understandings of international relations in order to shape policies, striving to maintain America's hegemonic status, leading to a severe misdirection in US strategy towards China. Being partners is the core interest of both the US and China, dictated by global peace trends. Becoming enemies is not a burden either side or the US or the world can bear. The gravity and significance of stabilizing China-US relations for global peace cannot be emphasized enough. Striving for this goal is of the utmost importance. Washington must understand that China is not afraid of US strategic pressure, will not yield to such pressure. China's repeated assertions are based on the overall situation and mutual interest so as to stabilize China-US relations. Washington must make adjustments, even if they are made gradually. The urgency and importance of these adjustments cannot be overstated. Now, what the Chinese are saying is that we have reached a crossroads. Blinken came to China with all sorts of ultimatums. He left China, and since he left China, the US has gone ahead and taken all kinds of steps that are clearly unfriendly to China. The current administration seems incapable of accepting that China has a role to play in the world and insists on trying to bully and threaten it. That is something the Chinese will never accept. And what it is doing instead is it's creating dividing lines and conflicts in the Pacific region and between China and the United States, which are ultimately threatening global peace. The same with Russia, the same with China. Who knows, before long, perhaps the same with India as well. Of course, it's been the same with Iran for a very long time now. An inability to see the world as the other side sees it and to look for mutually effective compromises. Instead, we have these disastrous plans, if they are plans, or at least threats to insert US troops to Ukraine, which we are now seeing are causing the Russians, far from backing off and backing down, to start engaging in tactical nuclear drills. And it's not just the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the Iranians who are pushing back. A most astonishing thing happened last week, which is that the International Criminal Court, an organization which has done the West's bidding almost whenever it's been asked to do, apparently now under colossal pressure from the United States and Israel and the Western powers to back off from going ahead with its possible plan to issue indictments and arrest warrants of Israeli leaders. Anyway, the International Criminal Court, under all this pressure, has finally been forced to issue a statement of its own, saying that it will not accept threats that attempting to interfere openly in its processes in the way that is now being done is not only impermissible, but opens the way for further legal action against those who are trying to conduct that pressure. Sooner or later, this is all going to end in a crash. There is already the makings of it in Ukraine. We see what the Chinese are saying. It's hardly surprising that even as Xi Jinping comes to France and tries to get Macron to see sense, he's going to Hungary and Serbia to reassure and support China's allies and Russia's allies as well in Europe, or friends at least in Europe. But we see that all this bullying, all these threats, all that they're doing are increasing risks, dangers to unimaginable levels, and they're even causing institutions like the ICC to push back. Never the word peace, never serious negotiations. The Russian Foreign Ministry has again said that it's open to negotiations based upon realistic proposals to end the conflict in Ukraine. The door still is not completely shut. But instead of negotiations, we're seeing instead drills involving tactical nuclear weapons and a crazy idea about strategic ambiguity when relations between states at a time of war require clarity and transparency above all, be used as a possible cover for the ultimate escalation of a direct war between the West and Russia over a country, Ukraine, which is about to lose its own war, and which, of course, is not a member of NATO or of the European Union, even now. Well, I hope, as I said, that the West is indeed bluffing with all of these moves, and that it is all strategic ambiguity. But some bluffs are incredibly dangerous, and this one certainly is. If I'm wrong, and of course the possibility is that I am, and that what Stephen Bryan is saying about the US, for example, thinking of authorizing its special forces at the very least to engage the Russians in Ukraine, well, if I'm wrong, well, what I've always said about neocons having no reverse gear will not only be proved to be true, but it will show the full and disastrous extent of what that means. Anyway, this is where I finished my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Please remember that you can you can support our work via Patreon subscribe star, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Let's see whether we get any more clarity about what the West is really intending to do over the next week or so. But for the moment, I have to say it looks as if the storm clouds are gathering. More from me soon, as I've said. Have a very good day.